What's going on, guys? Jim Surratt, Hammer Strength and Conditioning, coming at you today. Last video, we talked about why the conjugate method is so effective for law enforcement and first responder populations. Okay, so today, continuing with that trend, I want to talk about, how do I put this? What most law enforcement and first responders get wrong about training, right? I'm not a huge fan of the you're doing it wrong type videos. Okay, so that's really not what I'm about today. But what I want to really try to do, the whole point of today, is to highlight sort of the standardized or the traditional methods of training that law enforcement and first responders engage in, and sort of pick apart why it might not be the most effective means of training for that profession. Okay, so again, this isn't an attack on any department or any individual or any group of individuals, nothing like that. Okay, if you train the ways that I'm talking about and it works for you, fantastic, right? Everybody's body is different, everybody's mindset is different, and everybody's demands are different. So if something works for you, then and it's producing results for you, and you are successful in your profession, in your career, and in your field, then by all means continue to do it. Okay, but I do want to talk about sort of the ideas that are persistent across law enforcement, first responder, or tactical training, and why they might not be ideal for those professions. Okay, so the first thing is over-reliance on cardio, right? So cardio does not directly equate to fitness, right? And what I mean by that is that most law enforcement, first responder, and tactical populations have this idea that if, I just run more, I'm gonna be in better shape. From an aerobic perspective, that's absolutely true, right? And an aerobic base is 100% necessary for success as a tactical first responder, right? But in today's day and age, whether it's warfare or policing or emergency response, more often than not, you are engaged in short, repeated bouts of violent intent and exertion, right? So we're no longer, if you're law enforcement, you're no longer riding a horse across a desert or across a plain, right? Or you're chasing down a fugitive, right? If you're in the military, we're not marching across open battlefields and having to cover great distances on foot. And if you're a first responder or an emergency medical responder, you're responding to an acute event, right? And so in my opinion, what the tactical population, again, particularly law enforcement and first responder, what they need is the ability to produce force or develop force rapidly across time in repeated bouts, right? So let's say SWAT, right? So you're a SWAT team guy, you get a call to do a hit on a house or do a mission on a house, and you have to breach the door. So you got to carry your kit, you got to carry your gear. Let's say you're the RAM guy or you're the breaching expert, and you got to set things up, right? So, and then once you gain entry into the house, let's say you have to engage with a suspect, right? And that is probably not, excuse me, that is most likely and hopefully not going to be a prolonged event, right? You're not going to have to grapple for 20 minutes with a suspect while backup arrives. You may find yourself in situations like that, absolutely. I've never been a cop, I've never been a SWAT guy, I've never been in the military, so I don't know specifically, but I would reckon, and it would stand to reason, that you probably don't have to engage with a combatant for more than a few minutes at a time, right? So what tactical responders need, what tactical professionals need, is the capacity to develop force, produce force rapidly, and sustain that force across time, across repeated bouts, right? So let's go back to the SWAT analogy or the SWAT idea. Let's say you are pursuing a suspect on foot. You may have to go over a semi-prolonged amount of distance, okay? But you're not running for 2, 3, 4, 5 miles, right? That's what cars and helicopters are for in this day and age, right? So what tactical professionals need to be able to do is exert a high amount of violence, and I don't mean like physical aggressive violence, but violent intent, effort, and exertion across a very short period of time, but be able to do so in repeated bouts, right? So again, having a strong aerobic base is absolutely vital, right? Aerobic fitness supports all their aspects just as much as, in my opinion, maximal strength does. It improves recovery times, it improves your cardiovascular health, lowers your blood pressure. That's really hard for me to say. All those things, right? So the more efficient you are at your aerobic capacity, the more efficient you're going to be at your anaerobic capacity, your maximal strength capacity, all that kind of stuff, right? Because you can recover quickly or more quickly. That does not mean, however, that every tactical professional or first responder needs to be able to run, a 13-minute 2-mile. It's just not going to happen, right? Especially in kit, in boots, all that kind of stuff, right? So when we look at fitness, we need to think about how can I train in a manner that allows me to mimic or that mimics most closely the parameters of the profession in which I find myself or the situations to which I'm exposed, right? So there's a couple different ways we can go with this. We're going to explore both avenues. So the first one is like zone 2 steady state cardio. I'm a big fan of that for aerobic fitness with low impact and low intensity, right? My CBP officer, my CBP agent, and my SWAT officer, they both run in their own time, so we don't run here. What we do though, is we engage in low intensity, steady state, sustainable output across time, right? So last night, for example, we did dynamic effort lower. So they did 10 sets of 2 at 55% plus 80 pounds in chain, box squat with the safety squat bar. And then they did 10 sets of 1 at the same percentage versus with the same amount of chain for conventional deadlift, right? So we're working on anaerobic capacity. We're working on repeatability of exertion, that kind of stuff. And then once we went through our accessory work, which builds your GPP, your work capacity, sort of indirectly, right? Shorter rest periods, higher, not super high, but higher type volume. We then went into a 15-minute carry medley, right? So I'm a big fan of like strongman events for the tactical professions because it does mimic or have carryover to what they do in the field, right? So last night we did a wheelbarrow for, let's call it, 50 yards maybe down and back, a 50-pound sandbag carry, and a 120-pound, so 60-pound dumbbell farmer's carry down and back, right? And so there was 2 of them, so it's rotated through the 3 implements, round and round for 15 minutes, right? So it's a fantastic way of building low intensity, steady state, zone 2 type cardio while improving grip strength, upper back strength, core strength, all that kind of stuff, right? So very functional type fitness. And I'm not a huge fan of the brand or the term functional fitness, but it does have its place. I think it does get bandied about way too much by industry professionals and industry influencers. Because really, at the end of the day, any training can be functional, right? Like, I'm a power lifter, and my maximal strength, if I go to pick something heavy up, is functional, right? Maybe not in a suit or in a bench shirt, that's not necessarily functional, but the strength that I develop through training with those modalities is indeed functional. Like, there's been very few things that I've encountered in my time that I couldn't lift or move outside of like a truck or a giant rock, right? But most day-to-day items, because of my strength, don't pose much of a challenge to me. So going back to the tactical realm with aerobic capacity and aerobic fitness, what I have seen a lot of, both anecdotally, so second, third, fourth hand, as well as first person or first hand views or first hand perspective, is the over-reliance on extended or prolonged bouts of running in order to engage in or create fitness, right? And again, I will always say that an aerobic base is absolutely important. One of the big arguments, this is not tactical, right? But one of the big arguments in sports performance is conditioning for baseball players or softball players, right? Because there's this, in my opinion, this misconception that baseball players have to be super well conditioned. It's true to a point, right? They have to have an aerobic base. However, the greatest amount of distance you are going to cover in a single bout of exertion is 360 feet. And that is if you are trying to beat the throw for an in-the-park home run. So 360 feet, 90, 180, 270, 360 from home to home. Right? So it's like, why should baseball players have to be able to run 2, 3, 4 miles at a certain pace when all they have to do is sprint 90 to 360 feet? Doesn't make any sense to me. The same applies, in my opinion, to tactical professionals, right? Most of the time, if you can take down a suspect or take down a fugitive within 100 yards, you're fine, right? And then it becomes a grapple, right? You apprehend the suspect, you grapple with them, you cuff them. Most of the time, you're not by yourself, so you have backup and you have support. But if you're pursuing a fugitive across 2-3 miles, like, shit has hit the fan. And you are by yourself and you've just overextended yourself, right? So this over-reliance or this over-belief, this hyperbolic belief in the utilization or the application of cardio, and meaning like prolonged zone 2, zone 3 cardio for fitness is, in my opinion, incorrect, right? Again, always have an aerobic base. Should you have the capacity to run 2 miles? Absolutely. Do I think it's valuable for a fitness test? To a point, right? But I think that for law enforcement officers, first responders, firefighters in particular, the ability to produce force rapidly, so develop force rapidly across a very short amount of time, but in repeatable bouts of effort and exertion is much more important than sustained cardiovascular capacity. Okay, so that's cardio, right? And then the next pint, right? Obviously I want to drink. The next point is over-reliance on maximal strength development, right? So usually the pendulum swings to the extreme of both ends, right? Both ends of the spectrum. So I can either be super fit or super strong, and very rarely do we end up in the middle, right? So a lot of law enforcement and tactical professionals believe that if you're just super strong, you're going to be just fine. Well, the inverse is actually true, right? Being super strong is very helpful, but you will find yourself in situations, whether you're military or first responder or law enforcement, where you will have to sustain effort across time, right? So it's kind of this like competing demands for resources, right? So developing maximal strength for the sake of developing maximal strength as a standalone characteristic is also incorrect, right? So again, as a power lifter, the whole premise of my competition is based around the lifting or the moving of maximal weights or super maximal weights. That is the entirety of my sport, right? I do not run, I don't do conditioning because I hate it, and I hate working out, and I hate exercising. I like lifting weights, and there's a very stark difference between those two things, okay? It is vitally important that tactical professionals are very strong, right? If we are looking at things from a physical perspective, like I was talking with my CBP agent about this the other night. You know, it's one thing to deadlift 300 pounds off the floor, but it's a static barbell. It doesn't resist you. If you get in the groove, you have an efficient means of moving it, right? 300 pounds from the floor is very different than even a 180 pound or 150 pound man or suspect, not even a man, but a 150 pound suspect trying to resist you, right? So I was a bouncer for a number of years in Springfield, Missouri. And one of the first things I learned is that you don't take anybody for granted, because there was one time I grabbed onto a woman who was about to get in a fight, and it was like grabbing onto a live wire. She was probably 120 pounds, maybe plus or minus, and she ended up biting me, right? And I learned my lesson real quick that you don't approach people from the back unless you want to get bit, right? But that you don't take anybody for granted, right? And that opposing forces are much more challenging to deal with than static forces, meaning that it's much more difficult to engage with a resisting suspect, somebody who's trying to actively resist your attempts to subdue them, as compared to lifting a 300, 400, 500, 600 pounds off the floor, right? 600 pounds off the floor is not an easy feat, but grappling with a 200 and some odd pound suspect who is actively resisting you and is trying to hurt you is much more difficult, right? So maximal strength absolutely plays a role in the development of tactical professionals, but it's not the end all be all, right? It is a component, and really there's like 3 or 4 primary components of tactical training that I'll try to summarize at the end of this video. The third thing that a lot of first responders and tactical professionals get wrong is they don't do any power training or any speed training, right? It's either maximal aerobic capacity or maximal strength, right? Again, like I was referring to, or as I alluded to, the ability to develop force rapidly over time or across time for repeated bouts is vitally important for first responders. Because again, let's say you're a firefighter and you're going upstairs, right? You don't have a ladder to the top floor. There's a fire on the top floor. You have to climb the stairs. So not only is it sustained aerobic output, but it's also sustained, prolonged, and repeated anaerobic output, right? So that's where dynamic effort lower comes in. We have repeated bouts of exertion at a prescribed or at a certain intensity with very short rest intervals in order to elicit a particular response and a particular adaptation. Also, I see a lot of, one of the things that I saw at First Group was lack of general athleticism, which plays into power, right? And I'm not saying you have to be able to run a route or catch a football or do anything like that. You don't have to be some crazy athlete, but athleticism as defined by being able to do a box jump or a broad jump or even a skip, or even just from a coordination perspective, karaoke or a basic ladder drill is also important, because coordination, power output, explosive ability, all those things are important to law enforcement and first responders because those are things that are called upon in the line of duty. So we do that, we address that issue by training plyometrically, so box jumps, broad jumps. We don't do broad jumps in here because one, I don't have the space, and two, it's all concrete, right? I'm not going to have my guys do broad jumps onto concrete. It's going to jack their knees up, their ankles, their hips, their low back, all that kind of stuff, and it's just the return on investment is too low and the risk to reward ratio is too lopsided in favor of risk versus reward. We can and do box jumps. Okay, I believe box jumps are a great plyometric, great power, explosive ability, developing modality, right? They're very simple. They're fairly low impact as compared to like a depth drop or a depth jump or a broad jump, right? Box jumps are much easier, they're much safer, and they're controllable, right? We also train that quality via the dynamic effort lower method, right? So we put bands or chains on, which I alluded to and referenced in the previous video. And we do low acute volume, and we only do like 2 reps per set, but the accumulated volume at that percentage is relatively high. And then we keep the rest intervals very short, okay, to allow for sub-maximal recovery. And basically, like, I don't want to say performative in the sake of like you're performing as something, but performative repetition in that you are capable of performing that activity repeatedly, right? So that's what I mean by performative. And then finally, if you don't train maximal cardio, if you don't train maximal strength, you often train like a bodybuilder, right? Back and bis, chest and tris, legs, shoulders and abs, that kind of stuff, right? Which is all well and good, right? But law enforcement, first responders, and tactical professionals are not bodybuilders. There are those professionals who are bodybuilders, but training like a bodybuilder is not going to make you inherently better as that professional, right? So training as a bodybuilder, being jacked up, being super yoked, that kind of stuff is not going to necessarily make you a better law enforcement officer. It might make you a more intimidating law enforcement officer. Like everybody who has big traps, big shoulders, big arms and lats, that kind of stuff are often more intimidating, but it's not going to make you perform better necessarily, right? But if you combine all those things, okay, if you train cardiovascular output, if you train power development, if you train maximal strength, and if you train hypertrophy all at the same time within the same session, and you raise all those qualities at the same time, that's when you start looking at things from the lens or through the lens of a tactical athlete, right? Because that's how athletes are trained, right? They improve hypertrophy, right? Because muscle is armor, right? So we train hypertrophy. We train power development for explosive ability. We train cardiovascular capacity for sustained or prolonged exertion. We train maximal strength for force output. So guess which method, just take a guess, works best, in my opinion, for training all those qualities at the same time? Conjugate method, right? So I guess I should say, like, again, who am I to say all this, right? Who am I to call out police officers? Who am I to call out firefighters? Well, for one, I'm not calling anybody out, right? I'm not attacking any individual here saying like, you, sir, or you, ma'am, are doing it incorrectly, right? But these are just observations that I've made training with both with the conventional Army at JBLM and then here at Fort Huachuca, as well as the Green Berets up at JBLM, and then having observed, read, listened to testimonials regarding law enforcement and first responder training. Okay, but again, who am I, right? Well, I have 12 years of experience as a strength and conditioning coach across Division I, minor league baseball, high performing tactical or high level tactical, and then elite powerlifting, right? So I don't know everything. I'm not the seminal expert, but I would consider myself learned enough and educated enough and exposed enough to be able to make these claims, right? So how do we address all these things? How do we address maximal strength, aerobic output, power development, and hypertrophy all at the same time? Well, we utilize the conjugate method. We have a max effort lower, a dynamic effort upper, or a repetition effort upper, dynamic effort lower, and then max effort upper. And then built into each one of those sessions from a tactical perspective, not a powerlifting perspective, but from a tactical perspective, built into each one of those sessions is hypertrophy, power development, and energy system development, okay? It's pretty simple once you get down to the brass tacks about it. How you piece it all together can get a little more nuanced because you got to think about, like I was talking about in my last video, there are very real consequences to success and failure within the tactical realm or within the tactical field, right? If you're a firefighter and you get hurt inside a burning building, you might not come out. Or if your buddy gets hurt inside a burning building and you're not strong enough to carry that person out, both of you could die. Very real things, right? If you are a law enforcement officer or a CBP agent, right, and you get into a scuffle with a suspect and that suspect overpowers you or gets your gun, like, you can die. There are very real consequences to success and failure across the tactical field. Powerlifting, I can get hurt 100%. I can get severely, majorly injured doing what I do and lifting the weights that I lift. But it's not life or death, right? And so when you look at things as a tactical strength and conditioning professional, you really have to take into consideration, and this really hit me one time, that there are very real consequences to these jobs, right? Very real life and death situations that these men and women put themselves in daily, okay, to either protect us or to rescue us, to save us, to help us, whatever it may be, right? So again, where do most tactical professionals go wrong? Over-reliance on cardio, right? Cardio is, especially running, is actually pretty high impact, maybe low intensity, meaning like the acute intensity of the exertion itself might be relatively low. Like you might be doing zone 1, zone 2, maybe zone 3 tops type stuff. But running is actually pretty abusive on your body, especially if you're inefficient at it or if you're running on a hard surface or if you don't have the appropriate shoes for it. Okay, so we find ways around that. We do carries, we do circuits for time, we do complexes, that kind of stuff. It still builds the motor, okay, still builds a bit bigger gas tank, but doesn't tax the chassis quite as much. Okay, and then on the opposite end of that spectrum, we have over-reliance on maximal strength, right? You can be super strong, but if you can't run, if you can't climb stairs, if you can't climb a ladder, if you can't drag somebody, you are a liability when it comes to being a tactical professional. If you don't do power development, you don't have the capacity to produce or develop force rapidly across time, and therefore you might not be able to chase down a suspect on foot. You may not be able to sprint up a flight of stairs in response to a call. You might not be able to jump out of a burning building or whatever it may be, right? And then finally, over-reliance on bodybuilding or hypertrophy-specific training, right? It's awesome to look good. Everybody wants big muscles. Everybody wants to be, have a six-pack, fucking yoked, all that kind of shit, right? We all want that. Every dude wants that, okay? But if we're looking at things through the lens of being a tactical athlete and a tactical professional, standalone specific hypertrophy training is not the answer, right? You have to do it. You have to do it as accessories to build muscle, to build armor, to build durability and resilience through the connective tissue and the soft tissue, as well as, bone, right? Exposure to load increases or improves bone density, improves bone health, strength, that kind of stuff, right? And so that's why we do the maximal effort method. We expose the body to maximal loads in order to drive both muscular hypertrophy as well as osteohypertrophy or bone hypertrophy, okay? As well as ligamentous, tendinous hypertrophy, right? That's why we do high volume stuff, right? Is because connective tissue is much more avascular or much less vascular than muscle tissue, right? So the patellar tendon that originates at the termination of the quads is far less vascular than the quads themselves. So we need higher volume training in order to drive nutrients into that tissue in order to drive adaptation and create a response. Okay, so again, this is not an attack on any particular department or any particular profession or any individual. These are just observations that I have made regarding where tactical professionals often go wrong, right? And it's important, to summarize, it's important that you train all these qualities at the same time, right? You can put an emphasis on cardio if you have a test coming up. And that's another thing, right? So that's where I was actually headed originally. Academies, so like police academy, fire academy, put a heavy emphasis on cardiovascular ability, right? Departments put an emphasis on fitness tests. Individuals put an emphasis on training how they want to, not how they need to, right? So you have all these competing priorities, right? So when you're in academy, whether you're police or CBP or firefighter, you're doing a lot of running to get yourself in shape. Makes sense, right? But then you're also learning all these things about how to be a cop, how to be a CBP agent, how to be a firefighter, how to be an EMT, all this stuff, right? And then departments, whether fire, medical, or police, or CBP, so agencies, focus more on the satisfaction and completion of tests in order to check a box, in order to collect metrics, rather than actual development of individuals across a physical perspective or through a physical perspective, right? They're more concerned about the data, the quantitative data, and the metrics collected through executing tests, so they can push that to their higher ups and say, look, we passed 70% of our tests, right? 70% of our population passed their fitness test. And individuals, the individual officers, firefighters, agents, soldiers, focus more on what they like to do rather than what they need to do. Okay, so you have all these competing interests, right? So again, utilizing the conjugate method for tactical professionals is, in my opinion, both personal and professional, very biased, the best option for training tactical professionals, okay? If you have questions, please feel free to send me a DM at HammerSNC on Instagram. You can go to my website, www.hammersnc.com. You can email me at hammersnc@gmail.com, or you can find me on Facebook, Hammer Strength and Conditioning. As always, don't waste the pain.